High above Europe in 1944, an American fighter plunges toward the Earth. Its engine screams in a rapid, desperate descent, dragging a thick trail of black smoke across the sky. For the pursuing Luftwaffe pilot, the tension evaporates. The dogfight is over. He breaks formation, gliding carelessly close to confirm the inevitable kill. Then, the impossible happens. The crippled American plane abruptly snaps upward, shedding its sluggishness in a violent, immediate reversal. It whips around, instantly turning its guns onto the exposed, stunned German hunter. The prey has become the predator. But how could a supposedly doomed aircraft pull off an ambush like this? The concept of playing possum in the sky has long been a staple of aviation folklore. For decades, post-war pulp magazines and modern internet legends have inflated these accounts, transforming desperate tactical gambles into exaggerated tales of lone pilots scoring impossible, rapid-fire kill streaks. But if we strip away the sensationalism, we find a highly documented, fascinating intersection of aerodynamic physics, specific engine technology, and lethal psychological manipulation. The truth behind the maneuver forces us to ask a difficult question. How exactly could a combat aviator intentionally fake the precise visual and aerodynamic symptoms of catastrophic damage, producing thick black smoke and simulating a terrifying loss of control at over 300 miles per hour, without actually throwing his machine into an unrecoverable death spiral? To understand the sheer mechanical risk of this deception and the psychological trap it set for a pursuing enemy, we first have to examine the unforgiving, high-stakes environment where these split-second decisions were made. By the spring of 1944, the airspace over occupied Europe had evolved into the most lethal and technologically advanced combat arena in human history. Aerial warfare at 25,000 feet was governed by a ruthless and visible currency, energy. For the pilots strapped into the cockpits of American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, survival was not dictated by aerobatic finesse. It was dictated by the strict laws of physics. Altitude was potential energy. Airspeed was kinetic energy. As long as a pilot maintained one or the other, he had options. He could climb, dive, extend, or fight. But the moment an aviator bled off that energy, his aircraft transformed from a lethal weapon into a suspended metallic target. Every combat manual, every pre-flight briefing at bases across England pounded this single doctrine into the minds of new pursuit pilots. Speed is life. Lose it, and you will not make it home. This doctrine was not theoretical. It was written in the losses of the early daylight bombing escorts, who had learned the hard way against the Luftwaffe's seasoned interceptor squadrons. The veteran German pilots flying the Focke-Wulf 190 were masters of energy management. The FW-190 was a brutal, heavy, radial engine machine designed for high-speed, slashing attacks. Armed with up to 4 20mm cannons, it could tear the wing off a Thunderbolt with a single 1-second burst. Luftwaffe doctrine taught its pilots to hunt with cold efficiency, dive out of the sun, slash through the formations, and immediately use the dive speed to zoom back up to a safe altitude. They did not want a prolonged, turning dogfight. They wanted quick, decisive kills. If an American fighter dropped out of formation, trailing behind, low and slow, it was recognized instantly as an easy mark, a straggler waiting to be swept up by a predator circling above. To understand the absolute insanity of a pilot deliberately feigning catastrophic damage, you have to look at what executing this deception actually required. To convince a veteran Focke-Wulf pilot that an American fighter was mortally wounded, the deception could not be half-hearted. A dying aircraft acts a specific way. It bleeds airspeed rapidly. It drops out of its protective element. It exhibits unstable flight characteristics, wallowing in the thin air, and crucially, it trails thick, oily smoke as internal systems supposedly fail. Therefore, to set this trap, an American pilot had to intentionally violate every core instinct of survival. He had to deliberately bleed off his vital kinetic energy while an enemy fighter was actively maneuvering onto his tail. He had to consciously slow his Mustang or Thunderbolt down to speeds where evasive maneuvers became sluggish, if not entirely impossible. He had to make himself a perfect, stable target in the gun sight of an opponent carrying heavy cannon armament. This was the fundamental paradox of the ambush. The maneuver's success relied entirely on psychological manipulation, specifically exploiting the German pilot's confidence. In aerial combat, when an opponent sees black smoke and a plunging aircraft, the immense pressure of the dogfight momentarily lifts. The hunter believes the battle is already won. The adrenaline shifts from a state of fight or flight to a relaxed anticipation of a confirmed victory. The bait is designed to make the pursuing Focke-Wulf pilot abandon his strict energy tactics, close the distance carelessly to watch the enemy burn, and drop his guard. But if the psychological trap failed, if the German pilot remained disciplined, stayed slightly out of range, and simply fired a final finishing burst into the supposedly crippled plane, the American pilot would have no airspeed left to dodge the incoming shells. It was a tactical gamble bordering on the suicidal. Transforming this theoretical death sentence into a functional, split-second reality in the skies over Germany required nerves of absolute steel and a deep mechanical mastery of exactly how far a fighter plane could be pushed before it truly fell out of the sky. The reality of the air war over Europe was that almost no pursuit pilot strapped into a fighter aircraft intending to deliberately play the victim. This deception was rarely drawn up on chalkboards in squadron briefing huts. Instead, it was a split-second reaction born out of sheer desperation. When an American aviator found himself outturned and staring at the imminent flashes of a Focke-Wulf locked firmly on his tail, the traditional playbook went out the window. If evasive maneuvers failed, the only option left was to convince the enemy that the battle was already over. To sell the illusion of a fatal strike, the pilot had to perform an act of deliberate mechanical manipulation. His left hand would snap to the throttle quadrant, specifically targeting the fuel mixture control. By violently slamming the lever fully forward into an excessively rich setting, he instantly flooded the engine cylinders with raw, unburned aviation fuel. The massive power plant choked on the sudden surplus of gasoline. Immediately, the exhaust stacks erupted, belching out thick, billowing clouds of heavy black smoke. To an observer trailing behind, it looked exactly like a catastrophic internal oil fire, the universal visual signature of a dying aircraft plunging toward the earth. For the pursuing German pilot, this sudden trail of dense smoke served as a profound psychological trigger. In the high-stress environment of a dogfight, visual confirmation of a kill is everything. Seeing that smoke fundamentally altered the dynamic of the engagement. The intense, adrenaline-fueled focus required to track and destroy an evasive target instantly evaporated. The German aviator's mindset shifted from high-alert combat to a relaxed assumption of definitive victory. The threat was supposedly neutralized. All that remained was to glide in close, follow the doomed machine down, and record the crash. At that precise second, the conflict fundamentally changed. The American was no longer fighting a war of aerodynamics and turning radiuses. He had shifted the battlefield, manipulating his enemy's psychology through the controlled mechanics of his own engine. The bait was cast, and the trap was firmly set. Now, the entire engagement hinged on exactly how the relaxed German hunter would react as he closed the distance. As the thick plume of oil-black smoke erupted from the American fighter's exhaust stacks, the entire tactical equation inside the pursuing Focke-Wulf 190 fundamentally shifted. For the German pilot strapped into the tight, ergonomic cockpit of the interceptor, the sight of that dark, billowing trail was the ultimate validation. In the Luftwaffe of 1944, claiming an aerial victory, an Abschuss, was not a simple matter of reporting a successful strike during a post-flight debriefing. The Reich Air Ministry enforced a notoriously rigid and bureaucratic verification process through its claims committee, the Abschusskommission. To receive official credit and avoid having a claim dismissed as unconfirmed, a pilot needed irrefutable proof, either gun camera footage from the Schusskamera showing strikes on a disintegrating airframe, or an independent visual witness confirming that the enemy pilot had bailed out, or that the aircraft had physically struck the ground. This systemic pressure dictated the behavior of German aviators in the final stages of a dogfight. The hunter could not simply fire a burst from long range and break away to seek another target. He had to linger. He had to follow the wounded prey down, close the distance, and visually document the final, inevitable collapse of the machine. Driven by this institutional requirement and blinded by target fixation, the German pilot eased the tension in his right arm, relaxing his grip on the KG-13 flight stick. He no longer anticipated a violent defensive break or a desperate high-G rolling scissors from the American. Why would he? A fighter belching black smoke at altitude was an engine casualty, a piece of flying scrap metal inevitably bound for the earth. Operating under this total confidence, the German pilot nudged the throttle lever forward, allowing his 14-cylinder BMW 801 radial engine to surge. He intentionally abandoned his defensive weaving and slid directly into the American 6 o'clock blind spot, closing the gap from 500 yards down to 300, his eyes locked onto the smoking silhouette filling his windscreen. At 300 yards, the Focke-Wulf was closing at a steady, controlled rate of overtake. Inside the German cockpit, the environment transformed from the frantic, high-G chaos of aerial combat to something resembling a routine training flight over the Baltic. Through the armored glass of the windscreen, the illuminated reticle of the Revi optical gun sight bounced gently against the fuselage of the trailing American fighter. The Focke-Wulf pilot's right thumb hovered lightly over the upper firing button, ready to unleash a final short burst from his 20mm MG-151 cannons if the American plane showed any sign of leveling out or attempting a forced landing. Yet there was no rush. The German aviator was now operating in a state of relaxed anticipation, entirely focused on framing the target for his gun camera. He was no longer scanning the surrounding airspace for enemy wingmen. His situational awareness had narrowed to the width of his gun sight reflector glass. He was reading the visual cues of the battle exactly as his training and thousands of previous combat engagements had taught him. Smoke meant engine failure, altitude loss meant structural or control degradation, and sluggish flight meant a pilot preparing to abandon ship. Every instinct told him that the fight was over, and that his only remaining task was to manage his glide slope and watch the canopy jettison. He had stepped directly into the psychological blind spot that the American maneuver was engineered to exploit. He had traded his tactical discipline for the certainty of a confirmed kill, completely unaware that the trailing smoke was not the product of shattered pistons or severed oil lines, but a deliberate, mechanically induced illusion designed to lure him into point-blank range. Inside the cockpit of the American fighter, the pilot's eyes were not looking down at his spinning altimeter or out at the horizon. They were fixed on the small, rectangular rear-view mirror mounted directly above the canopy frame, or glancing back over his shoulder through the plexiglass bubble. The timing of what had to happen next was an unforgiving mathematical calculation executed in a fraction of a second. If the American initiated the trap while the Focke-Wulf was too far back, at 400 yards or more, the German pilot would have sufficient visual warning and aerodynamic space to simply pull up, preserve his altitude, and abort the pass. If the American waited a half-second too long, allowing the heavy German interceptor to close within 100 yards without reacting, the Focke-Wulf's nose would align for a point-blank execution shot, where even a random, careless squeeze of the cannon trigger would instantly tear the American airframe to pieces. The sweet spot was a narrow, terrifying corridor at roughly 200 to 250 yards. Watching the Focke-Wulf's nose grow steadily larger in the glass, the American pilot reached the absolute threshold of the deception. In a single, violent, synchronized movement, he executed the physical braking maneuver. His left hand slammed the throttle lever backward, chopping the engine power from full military thrust to complete idle in an instant. Simultaneously, his right hand and feet crossed the flight controls in a brutal, deliberate input. He jammed the right rudder pedal hard to the floorboard while throwing the control stick firmly to the left. Rather than banking cleanly into a turn, the aircraft was forced into a radical, uncoordinated forward slip, skidding sideways to the sky while pointing its nose away from the actual direction of travel. The physical effect of forcing a high-speed fighter into a hard forward slip at over 300 miles per hour was instantaneous and violent. By turning the fuselage slightly sideways to the oncoming airflow, the American pilot exposed the entire flat lateral surface of the airplane to the supersonic blast of the slipstream. In a fraction of a second, the sleek aerodynamic profile of the fighter was replaced by a massive wall of parasitic drag. Inside the cockpit, the deceleration did not feel like applying the brakes on a runway. It felt like slamming into an invisible airborne barrier. The pilot was thrown aggressively forward against his shoulder webbing with crushing force as the kinetic energy of his aircraft evaporated into violent turbulence. The airframe shuddered and groaned under the massive structural loads, the aluminum skin vibrating as the airflow separated over the wings and fuselage. The airspeed indicator needle plummeted across the dial, dropping dozens of miles per hour in a heartbeat. For the pursuing Focke-Wulf pilot, trailing just 200 yards behind, this instantaneous loss of speed created a terrifying optical phenomenon. In the human brain, the perception of an object's approach velocity relies on how rapidly its angular size expands on the retina. At steady speeds, that expansion is gradual, but when the lead aircraft suddenly sheds a massive percentage of its velocity while the trailing fighter is still under engine power, the rate of closure collapses exponentially. Inside the German cockpit, the American fighter did not appear to simply slow down. It seemed to suddenly freeze in midair and reverse direction, backing up toward the Focke-Wulf at impossible speed. In less than the span of a single breath, the smoking silhouette in the German's windscreen exploded from a distant target into a massive aluminum wall, filling his entire forward field of view. The psychological shift inside the German pilot's mind was brutal and absolute. The relaxed, confident anticipation of a confirmed kill vanished in a millisecond, shattered by a primal, adrenaline-spiked surge of pure panic. Target fixation dissolved into an immediate life-or-death struggle to avoid a catastrophic mid-air collision. The German pilot's left hand reacted instinctively, yanking the throttle lever back toward idle, while his right hand pulled violently back on the control stick, desperately attempting to haul the heavy fighter's nose up and over the obstruction. But the laws of physics that govern aerial combat are entirely indifferent to human reflex times. A Focke-Wulf 190A8 loaded with fuel, ammunition, and heavy pilot armor weighed nearly 8 tons. At over 300 miles per hour, that immense mass carried a terrifying amount of kinetic inertia. The mechanical response time of the control surfaces, combined with the quarter-second delay of human neural processing, meant that evasion was mathematically impossible. The German fighter could not shed its velocity, nor could it alter its vector in the remaining 80 yards of airspace. Rocketing forward like a runaway freight train, the Focke-Wulf surged uncontrollably past the decelerating American fighter. It plunged directly through the turbulent propeller wash and the lingering clouds of black exhaust smoke, shearing past the American aircraft at a closure rate of nearly 100 miles per hour. For a singular, frozen microsecond, as the two machines passed, the German pilot flashed directly alongside the American's cockpit canopy. Looking across the narrow gap of empty air, the German did not see a wounded, panicked enemy preparing to bail out of a burning wreck. He saw an aircraft entirely intact, its control surfaces responding, and its engine sound. The chilling realization gripped him instantly. There was no mechanical failure. The smoke was a lie. He had been lured into an absolute engineered overshoot. As the heavy silhouette of the Focke-Wulf flashed past the canopy and blurred into the airspace directly ahead, the tactical inversion was complete. But the American pilot had no time to celebrate the success of the deception. The ambush now hinged entirely on a microscopic 2-second window of opportunity. If the American hesitated for even a heartbeat, the German pilot would use his retaining kinetic energy to push his nose down, accelerate into a dive, or pull up into a vertical zoom climb, instantly opening the distance and reestablishing his tactical dominance. The recovery had to be as violent and decisive as the break. The American pilot instantly neutralized the flight controls, releasing the heavy rudder pressure and centering the stick to snap the fighter out of its shuddering slip. Simultaneously, his left hand slammed the throttle quadrant back forward to full military power, forcing the engine to catch and accelerate the airframe before it stalled out in the thin, high-altitude air. With his machine flying clean once more, he kicked the rudder pedal just enough to swing the aircraft's nose into alignment with the receding Focke-Wulf. The German fighter, now directly ahead and traveling away at high speed, was completely stripped of its defensive advantages. Its heavy belly and tail assembly filled the center of the American's optical gun sight, filling the glowing reticle ring without any need for complex deflection calculations. The Hunter had shot past his target, presenting his rear hemisphere at point-blank range, entirely blind and defenseless against what was coming next. Squeezing the trigger on the flight grip, the American pilot unleashed the full destructive force of his armament. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns roared to life simultaneously, sending a dense, concentrated torrent of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition bridging the 70-yard gap between the two aircraft. At this intimate distance, there was no dispersion of the bullet cone. The streams of lead converged like a solid industrial saw blade, tearing ruthlessly into the Focke-Wulf's empennage. The heavy slugs punched through the thin aluminum skin of the tail cone, severing the elevator control cables and shattering the internal aluminum formers before tracking relentlessly forward into the fuselage and the rear armor plate of the cockpit. The Focke-Wulf, caught entirely unprepared in the middle of an uncontrolled overshoot, shuddered violently under the kinetic hammer blows of hundreds of rounds striking home in a matter of seconds. Yet as the smoke cleared from the guns and the immediate adrenaline of the point-blank ambush began to subside, the illusion of this maneuver as a clean, effortless tactical victory dissolved. The execution of such a split-second reversal was not a consequence of superior aircraft design or effortless pilot dominance. It was a desperate, razor-thin gamble that carried an exorbitant operational cost, forcing the surviving pilot to confront the brutal physical reality of what he had just subjected his machine and his life to achieve. When we review declassified 8th Air Force gun camera footage and scrutinize post-mission combat debriefings, the romanticized myth of the effortless aerial ambush immediately evaporates. The reality captured on film is stark and ugly. By intentionally forcing a heavy fighter into a massive aerodynamic brake to trigger the overshoot, the American aviator had completely surrendered his kinetic currency. He was no longer flying gracefully, he was stalling. For several terrifying seconds after the kill, his aircraft hung almost motionless in a hostile sky, stripped of the speed necessary to evade any other Luftwaffe interceptors circling above. But this extreme aerodynamic vulnerability was only half of the operational cost. The very mechanical action required to set the trap, violently slamming the mixture control forward to drench the cylinders in raw, unburned fuel to produce that deceptive black smoke, carried a severe, sometimes fatal, penalty. High-performance aviation engines in 1944, whether the liquid-cooled Packard Merlin or a massive Pratt & Whitney Radial, were highly strung, temperamental machines. intentionally flooding them, routinely fouled the spark plugs, washed vital lubricating oil off the internal cylinder walls, and risked catastrophic internal detonation. An American pilot could perfectly execute the psychological trap, watch the Focke-Wulf plummet away, only to feel his own instrument panel vibrating violently as oil pressure plummeted and engine RPMs began to surge and drop. He had simply traded the immediate threat of a German 20mm cannon shell for the slow, agonizing certainty of mechanical failure. Winning that 5-second duel over occupied Europe often meant condemning his own aircraft, leaving him nursing a dying, choking engine for hundreds of miles, desperately hoping it wouldn't seize completely before he crossed the freezing expanse of the English Channel. Yet nursing a crippled engine home was only possible if the aviator actually survived the absolute peak of the physical maneuver itself. The true climax of this deception was not the gunfire, nor the fouled engine. It was the microsecond of absolute structural violence when the trap was physically sprung. To achieve that impossible deceleration, the American aviator had to reach down and slam the flap handle fully open while plummeting at well over 300 miles per hour. Every technical manual strictly prohibited deploying flaps at those extreme combat velocities. Doing so turned carefully engineered aerodynamic surfaces into blunt metal air brakes colliding head-on with a hurricane-force slipstream. The resulting aerodynamic drag was instantaneous and catastrophic. Inside the cockpit, the deceleration violently launched the pilot forward, pinning him against his heavy canvas shoulder harness with bone-jarring force. But the human toll was secondary to the terrifying mechanical reality. As those hydraulic flaps dug into the rushing air, the entire aircraft shuddered as if striking a solid wall. The massive wings of the fighter bent upward, groaning under an immense, unnatural load. The aluminum skin rippled, and the heavy structural rivets screamed in protest as the sheer wall of drag threatened to shear the assemblies and potentially the wings themselves directly off the main spar. Pinned in this violently vibrating, rapidly decelerating metal box, the American pilot was completely defenseless. His kinetic energy was entirely gone. He could not dodge, he could not weave, and he could not run. In that deafening climax, his survival hinged exclusively on the enemy's psychology. He wagered everything on the premise that the German pilot, completely seduced by the illusion of a smoking, dying aircraft, was so deeply certain of victory that he would simply hold his fire. If the hunter's discipline held, or if he squeezed the cannon trigger just a fraction of a second before the inevitable overshoot, the American would be instantly obliterated. It was a terrifying collision of extreme mechanical stress and human reaction time, pushing the absolute boundaries of what both man and machine could endure to manipulate the brutal arithmetic of the air war. When we return to the image of that smoking fighter suddenly snapping upward, the context of the maneuver is entirely transformed. We are no longer watching an effortless, cinematic act of airborne dominance. We are witnessing an act of desperate, near suicidal psychological manipulation. The historical record confirms that executing this violent deceleration was not a testament to the inherent superiority of American pilots or the flawless engineering of their aircraft. It was a brutal gamble that violated every established rule of aerial combat to exploit a single fundamental human flaw, the intoxicating relief of presumed victory. The maneuver demonstrates how the rigid technological laws of aerial warfare, where kinetic energy dictated life and death, could be abruptly shattered by unpredictable human desperation. The American pilot survived not because he outturned the Focke-Wulf, but because he weaponized his own vulnerability. He forced the enemy into an optical illusion, proving that extreme confidence could cause even a seasoned hunter to abandon strict tactical discipline and cross into the fatal radius of the trap. Ultimately, this split-second ambush reveals the true, unromantic nature of the air war over Europe. It was an environment where survival rarely came down to dogfighting elegance. Instead, life was preserved in the margins of terror, where a pilot had to be willing to intentionally push his machine to the absolute brink of catastrophic failure, just to steal one desperate second of advantage from a confident enemy. In the unforgiving physics of dogfighting, playing dead was never a brilliant tactical master plan. It was simply the very last thing a pilot tried before he actually died.